Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on Larva, Midsummer Night's Babel by Julián Ríos. This is an extraordinary, highly unconventional novel. There's almost nothing like it. Ríos published this book in 1983, and 40 years later, it is still far beyond what we think of in terms of postmodern fiction, metafictional techniques, unconventional or experimental novels. This book is far in advance of most of those. It is scouting out a terrain of literature that few writers will ever venture to. And there's a reason for that, because this can be a very challenging book. This is a book that made me laugh on almost every page. It's also a book that made me raise my eyebrow, reach way back into my memory, jump online and look something up, because there is an encyclopedia of ribald references in this book. Ríos is looking across a survey of literature. He takes the idea of Babel very literally. There are references across dozens, plural, of languages, including Morse code at one point, in the first 30 pages, no less. There are choices that Ríos makes that make it very clear that this is not a book that is going to entice you with its plot, with its narrative. There is a narrative, but Ríos is fascinated by language, by the way in which we can encode meaning through words, and the way that we can compress meaning, the way that a word can mean two different things and draw in two different ways. There are ways in which this book acts as a choose-your-own-adventure because of the linguistic choices, the portmanteaus that Ríos frequently makes up, the misspellings that create double meanings, triple meanings across sentences. It's extraordinary. Ríos is looking back across centuries of literature. He looks back to writers like Rabelais, Swift, Sterne. The great James Joyce, and Finnegan's Wake is what he is most firmly reaching towards and standing upon when he writes this book. And so it's extraordinary. And yet it is also an incredibly challenging book. It is an encyclopedia of ribald references. It is a scatological symphony of perverted puns. So that may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I want to give you a taste of what this book can read like. And here's how we begin. Pluck the clover, harped black-haired Sleeping Beauty in her vaporous black nightie as she pushed her way through the thicket of serpentwining masks in the Hall of Mirrors. Pluck the clover, smilingly sleepwalking with arms extended toward the three glass doors open to the bosky night. In the background, among the shadows in the rear garden of the villa, a bonfire gleamed. Pluck the clover? On the night of St. John? Yes, in the masquerade of a dark Don Juan night, with a harpy ending. Prepared by filmmaker Bob Hitchcock, with so many hitches in that rambling nut house or villa of mysteries across from Bishop's Park in the Teams. Midsummer madness at Fulham's Folly, on orders from his boss, Mr. Napoleon. And so it just continues from there. But what I didn't reference was the fact that across those two paragraphs, 4 different footnotes, because on the facing pages of the text are all the footnotes. And so one can read the text, and the references there are myriad. They're incredible. They are often very funny. If you read it out loud or you sub-vocalize the words, it becomes clear how the double and triple meanings are sort of cascading across one another. And yet across the page on those footnotes, there's more. Because the very first footnote occurs after the very first 3 words. Pluck the clover, footnote 1. The trifolium of our Roman Acli, 3 partying through our foliado, do I, don't I, he loves me, he leaves me not, leaf by leafing through the nocturne notes of our bacchantes, back hunting buckbeans in the back country, seek dartful lodger your tarts in Hyde Park, living in clover, sabre cli, a sumptuous trio, the summer sum of some of the, there's no threesome foliado, he would calculate it, he asked himself one night, that highest bidder of 1,000 aliases, paperillously perusing papers with his Babelic beauty. Sing, christening after christening in the tower of paper. Babel, Menelaus, and her narrator. Qui? She inquired. Who? A sort of ventriloquacious nut who misproduces our voices, he explained. A cunning co-founder and confounder. The ecomenter who doubles us and tries to root in black and white everything we live and write and route. Twice as crazy for being split. Nair and Tor. So I germangled him into her narrator. Ah bon, you'll get to know him. And so we have these metafictional things. We are introduced there in the footnote to the 2 voices who will proceed through this wild adventure of a night, perhaps just one, perhaps a series of nights, perhaps a dream across one night, not unlike Finnegan's Wake. Menelaus, 1,000 aliases, 1,000 names, never to know his true one, and Babel. And the two of them will interact, and they'll interact with this hair narrator who's mysterious. But within the footnotes, there are endnotes known as the pillow notes, allegedly compiled by, rough drafted by Babel, and translated with hair narrator's interpolations by Malleus. And so the very first phrase initiates a footnote which ends in an endnote. And so one is jumping back, and you might be reminded at this point by David Foster Wallace, and specifically Infinite Jest, because that is the feeling. There's some 100 pages of endnotes that are only referenced in the footnotes that you are springing back and forth through across the book. And here's what's most absurd. The endnotes at the end are by far the most normal narrative-like story. The roar of infernal music, shamrock, rock, crashed in rock and rolling waves up Fulham Palace Road, and the breakers grew bigger. Rave up, red-daubed on the rear door of the fully graffitied van. Go! Of the rock and rant group, shamrock, parked across the alley. Rave up, read the Cockney taxi driver, nodding assent. Wild party, man. The headlights flashed upon 3 hearts on the massive black iron knob door and lit up the graffiti on a brick wall supporting wrought iron. Babel Tower, Via Mara. That seemed a lot more coherent than what we were experiencing in the main narrative. And so that is what Julián Ríos is forcing a reader to engage with. And as I said, it's a challenging work. It's something that not everyone is going to enjoy. There's a reason that copies of this are not just sitting around in used bookstores everywhere, or that it's not frequently referenced, because I think there is this sense of puzzle that exists within the narrative. There is a narrative here. As I said, the book is drawing primarily on Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. It is more accessible in many ways than the types of references Joyce was making across Finnegan's Wake. One does not need to be steeped in Joyce's cultural experiences in order to appreciate many of the jokes. As I said, most of these are literary. There are references across numerous works, and Ríos and the translators helpfully provide some 100, probably about 200 different individual writers who have been referenced across the text, with like pages and where you can find the references to these writers. So that's where Ríos is drawing from. And so the book is in many ways more accessible than Finnegan's Wake, while having a narrative that is simultaneously far less coherent. It can be puzzling at times to be keeping track of the names. The idea that there is this 1,000-aliased character who's writing notes and speaking and joining in with whatever's happening with this Don Juan and across this night of adventures, or perhaps plural nights, dropping into the past, drawing on these experiences. It is quite absurd. It's surreal. But the linguistic references, the verbal wordplay, is what Ríos is emphasizing, and that is what I enjoyed most across the book. As I said, it is highly scatological. There are many, many references. It's about Don Juan, and Don Juan was famous for something. And so Ríos is doing that. But there is a narrative we can follow. We are able to follow, particularly as I went farther and farther along, I was able to see how there are thematic loops within the book. As much as this is bursting with ideas, with these repetitions where a phrase is shifted just slightly with the different spellings, as I mentioned, there is a coherent excess, as Umberto Eco would say, where yes, it seems to work through the infinite permutations of the references, yet they're drawing around some individual figure or literary work to create some semblance of structure that exists across the book. In the middle of it, once we've gotten used to reading the facing pages, jumping to the pillow notes, jumping back, rereading pages, there's then this 70-page section or so where there's not a single pillow note, and we just kind of work through and spend time with the main narrative, such that it is. And so it was a work that was intensive, and yet, as I said, I laughed pretty much on just about every page. I wanted to share a few more examples of how Ríos makes his sort of explicit references. So in one, here's one some readers might be able to pick up. We'll meet again at night in Deptford, Don Juan, as if trying to remember. In Deptford? And the shadow, yes, at the old St. Nick Church. The two facing skulls will have all eternity to gossip. Vida ad infiernitum. Don Juan with a gesture of impatience or impotence. You gotta be cracked. In the shadow, delighted. Lunatics all round. Amorous vagabondage. Me fil tot fele. But if you're reading it rapidly, mes fil tot feliz. Mephistopheles. And so there we have a reference to Deptford, where Christopher Marlowe died. There's undoubtedly ones I am missing here. The old St. Nick Church, St. Nick being a reference, old scratch, perhaps some type of reference to the devil, to Satan, who Faust had made his bargain with. And ending there with the French phrase that read phonetically spells out Mephistopheles. And in fact, me fil tot fele has a footnote jumping over Mephistopheles, le père la fille. And so there, it's drawn out and made a little more clear. Earlier on that page, there was a footnote that said, Mal Chatenorio and Faustus, Dr. Johann und Don Juan, the strange case. Because one of the references he's been making is a strange case of Freud and Dr. Johann, Dr. Faustus, Don Juan, Dr. Jean, and Mr. Freud, Sigmund Freud. And so he's making those references as well. But here we have this sort of circling reference of focused on Marlowe, Faust, Mephistopheles, and drawing a link between the legends around Faust that had also been linked to the mythical historic Don Juan and that personage. And so the section on the shadow is really quite fascinating. Later on, we have one night, con solos, alone, a knot in the throat. Did I tell you it was a charm? How do you spell your spell? And you twisting the cord, toying with my key. An alcoholic easily loses it. Would you take me home? Your nightly daring, silky kiss, exquisite. We didn't look each other in the face. Tell me. I insist that you answer. A man without a name for a woman without a man. Tell me, what's in a name? I whispered it to you in that kiss, the whole truth and nothing but, not the diminutive. I renege. Reinnocence man, his sigh, his shock. A car went by and the light dazed me, furrowed brow. You were wrinkling up too. Are you denying that kiss? My keys, where are the keys? It's still up to you to open the last door, Bluebeard. And then within that, we get our reference to Finnegan's Wake with one of the footnotes again. Given, away, alone, alost, alaved, along the Nurevir, where echoing sort of the final sentence in Finnegan's Wake. But we see just sort of how that cascade of language progresses across the book. That was the way I was reading it. I was really enjoying those aspects of it. Later we have this one, lively Salome Messalina waltzing with flutters of her muslin veils around the puppet. Cape falling down, put up your crest, Don Johann. Cap'n, raising her rooster and measureless kitchen knife. Cap'n, Helen from Holland. And there we see one of the portmanteaus that Ríos uses across the book, where he takes Salome and Messalina and pushes them together to make one word. And so as we're reading it, we can read it as lively Salome, lively Messalina, the dance of the veils, the way that there are parallels around both Salome and Messalina, sort of as again, historical personages. The way that Ríos is taking names and using the mythical foundations that we associate with those names to create these pictures and create these sort of anchor points that he then is circling around with all of his verbal wordplay. And as I said, that's what I enjoyed in the book, that it really is quite pleasurable. Towards the end, we get one of the most explicit references to The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy Gentleman by Lawrence Stern, one of my all-time favorite books. He's going through midnight, Mr. Midnight, a Cinderella in rags, drinking from a Bordeaux red slipper, attended by a horned devil in a Spanish cape who limped along, his left foot bare, bearing a bottle of champagne. The hands on the cock embraced, and she laughed lasciviously, tickling the poor lame devil who writhed, his tail between his legs. And within that, a cock and bull story. Wind up the clock! The timeless cuckoo clock of Great Hall, broken down and out of time. Cock and bull story is how Tristram Shandy is referred to, and wind up the clock is a reference to how Tristram was conceived infelicitously. Great book, by the way, if you've never read that one. And so, as I said, the book really is something extraordinary. It took me about 2.5 weeks of focused reading and really just giving myself over to the experience, being willing to jump across the pages and engage with the narrative fracture. So one recommendation I might make if you're interested in reading Larva, because it's worth it if you want to engage with the text, with what Ríos is aiming for the reader to experience, is perhaps to start reading just the main narrative pages. Don't worry about the footnotes. Just read the main narrative pages for about 20 pages. Get a sense of the rhythms with the way that the main narrative is jumping around. Who are the main characters? Then go back, reread those, and just keep an eye out. Anytime there's a pillow note, not even reading the whole footnotes, just anytime there's a pillow note, jump back to the back, read the pillow note. That builds it. The pillow notes really do amplify and act as sort of the railroad tracks, the undergird what's happening in the book. And then go back, reread those first 20 pages and get a sense of what it's like to jump from reading the main narrative, jumping over to the footnote, back to the pillow note when necessary, back to the main narrative, and how those rhythms are going to work. There is something that's very lifelike, that feeling of having a memory that's on the tip of the tongue, that's just around the corner, that Ríos creates within this book. So I recommend it, but I do caution readers about what you're going to experience in this extraordinary book. Now, certainly, one of the works I was reminded of, well, I think at the very top, it has to be Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. I will link my video on this book in the description box. This is something I almost want to return to now that I've spent more time with someone, trying to stand on Joyce's shoulders and do something interesting in that vein. Certainly another work that felt very close, very important, would be David Foster Wallace, specifically Infinite Jest, even though he used that same technique of forcing the narrative to fracture with his endnotes in his essays, or footnotes in his essays and stories. And so Infinite Jest would be up there. The references around shamrock and bands and such, bring up Thomas Pynchon, probably Gravity's Rainbow would be the one that is closest in terms of just the wild panoply of puns, references, facts, details, myth, history, that's all just shoved together into this wild stew. Speaking of which, certainly with a stew, I think the Mulligan Stew by Gilbert Sorrentino feels approximately in the same ballpark. The expansive language that's used, the sort of circular language, elliptical references, wordplay for the sake of wordplay, is a hallmark of Alexander Theroux in his writing. I would add the great Carlos Fuentes. I think probably with Terra Nostra is where he's most explicitly trying to craft that just maximal narrative. But Fuentes was a huge fan. And one of the unique aspects of Larva is that it was originally written in Spanish. Now there are, as I said, references across numerous different languages. But curiously, the entire book is set in London. And one of the great puns across the text is taking English and Inkglish. The idea that the language is inked into the page, and that's where it really resides and exists. And that's one of the major references. But Ríos helped with his translators, Richard Allen Francis and Suzanne Jill Levine. He worked with both of them to translate the full work. Additionally, I had mentioned those works, but the scatological nature of it, I think, certainly is close to what Nádas Péter is doing within sort of our lifetimes as well, with parallel stories. The encyclopedic, kaleidoscopic nature, we would recall Duck's Newburyport by Lucy Ellmann, not only in our time, but in our century. Don Juan by Byron, also Moliere's Don Juan, are crucial texts, I think. There's a great reference to Beckett's Godot in the work, but I think it's probably closer to what Beckett was doing in The Unnameable, or perhaps his earlier novels like Murphy and Watt. The absurdity of JR by William Gaddis feels very crucial. Sort of sections of Gregor von Risori's writings. I'm particularly interested to see if Abel and Cain gets closer to what was happening here. There's a real sense of Borges in here. There are explicit references to compasses, which brought up death in the compass. But the idea that Borges could view the world through this fractured sense of, hall of mirrors qualities, that is very much what Ríos is making even more explicit. And again, another work I'm curious to see, deeply influenced by Joyce, would be Jerusalem by Alan Moore. I'm curious to see what types of intertextuality exist perhaps here as well. A crucial portmanteau across the entire book with Babel and the nature of Babel and the languages that are exploding is a portmanteau between Rimbaud and Baudelaire. Baudelaire keeps popping up across the work, and I think the poetry of both writers is important. Within Faust, not only Marlowe's Faust, but also the Faust of Johann Goethe. Particularly, I think Faust Part 2, much less Faust Part 1, but primarily Faust Part 2, and sort of the just wild, maximal sense of what happens in that work. Ricardo Reis, one of the heteronyms of Pessoa, is in here. As I had mentioned, Lawrence Sterne, that we even get a page that's fully black. A very explicit reference to Sterne, I think. Aristophanes with the scatological nature of the writing, the very explicit sexuality that's on display. I had mentioned Molière's Don Juan. And I would say something like Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov or Steps by Jerzy Kaczynski. These both are works where there's that level of reference, but also something that's a little more sinister going on. And finally, a couple of crucial reference works. Rabelais, I think, is a massive influence on Ríos. The Arabian Nights are very explicitly called out. Sinbad is a crucial character across a number of the different sections, and certainly Jonathan Swift in a variety of ways, not just Gulliver's Travels, but the Houyhnhnms get a call out. Another writer sort of within the latter 20th century would be Ishmael Reed, I think, with Mumbo Jumbo specifically. Then the last few major references, there's a lot of references to Don Quixote from Cervantes. And Edith Grossman actually translated one of Rios's later works, Monstruari, which I'll be very curious to read. And then the last two, Henry Miller. I think maybe with the Sexus Plexus Nexus Rosy Crucifixion trilogy, but really I think his ethos is very close. And then of course Midsummer Night's Babel, Shakespeare with the Midsummer Night's Dream. The very first word, pluck the clover, and the references that perhaps exist there to Puck. Titania is referenced at length. And there are ideas around various, sort of romantic fairies, supernatural aspects, mystically realistic aspects. And so I think Shakespeare is a great totem as well. And with the verbal wordplay, the puns, the allusions he was creating, I think Ríos is explicitly following in that vein, crafting something new, something curious, something that deserves attention. So let me know if you've ever read this. Let me know if you've ever read any of his works. What your experiences have been, and let me know if you do decide to read it. I'd be curious because, as I said, there are many aspects to it that I really did laugh at and enjoy and think were piquing my curiosity. So I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.